To begin with, introduction to the MITRE ATT&CK Framework. Now, I've structured this to make sense in the context of red teaming and adversary emulation, and also make sense to defenders and blue teamers. But I'm going to introduce it anyway, in case there's anyone here that doesn't know what it is. So the MITRE ATT&CK Framework is a globally accessible knowledge base of adversary tactics and techniques based on real-world threats and threat actors, also known as APT groups. It was developed to improve our understanding, or the understanding, of how cyber attacks are performed from commencement or rather initiation all to, or until the point of impact or exfiltration. What does ATT&CK stand for? It is an abbreviation for adversarial tactics, technique, and common knowledge. And the common knowledge is an area or a segment that is typically not appreciated by people who utilize the ATT&CK framework, typically speaking. Of course, I can't speak for everyone, but common knowledge and the common language that the ATT&CK framework infers directly on anyone who uses it is very, very important, because a lot of tools, frameworks, security solutions now incorporate the MITRE ATT&CK framework nomenclature and naming schemas, TTP IDs, so on and so forth. So very important there. What is the MITRE ATT&CK framework used for? Well, it's typically employed or used as a baseline and a model for adversarial behavior, and highlights the various phases of an adversary or threat attack lifecycle. So what software they utilize and what operating systems or platforms they target on a larger or broader scale. And it is mostly utilized by blue teamers and red teamers to plan, implement, and orchestrate engagements based on specific threat actors or APT groups. This is where you have adversary emulation and simulation. And it's also a valuable resource for blue teamers, as it details the various TTPs used by specific threat actors and provides companies with valuable cyber threat intelligence that can consequently be used to implement or to improve defenses and mitigations. And of course, as you already know, MITRE ATT&CK categorizes adversarial techniques or adversarial behavior into a collection of tactics, further organized or subdivided into techniques, sub-techniques, and procedures, also known as TTPs. Right, and for those of you that have utilized the MITRE ATT&CK framework before, you know that this is the enterprise matrix, as opposed to matrix, but you can see that it highlights pretty much a very holistic life cycle or kill chain, starting off from reconnaissance all the way to impact and or exfiltration. And these are essentially tactics right over here. So reconnaissance, resource development, initial access, execution, persistence, prevesc, so on and so forth. Those are all tactics. And you can see that tactics consist of techniques, and the techniques that fall under a tactic are highlighted here vertically. And then for specific techniques, you can see that they either have in brackets a number, or have this little hamburger menu that's currently collapsed. But that simply infers that that particular technique has sub-techniques, and then of course procedures that fall under a said technique or sub-technique. But yeah, most of you should be familiar with this, so I'm not saying anything new. One thing to understand is that the MITRE ATT&CK framework at the top level is categorized, organized in the form of matrices that highlight the target environment, or the environment that adversaries will typically target. And that distinction is very important. So you'll typically see that you'll have the following matrices. One of the newer ones is the pre-matrix, which essentially separates adversary preparation phases, where you have reconnaissance and resource development, as they are very, very important phases. And then you have enterprise mobile ICS, which is ICS, OT, industrial control systems, etc. So the reason for this separation is because different APT groups or threat actors target different types of environments, right? So enterprise environment is what most of you are already familiar with. You can see we have Windows, Mac OS, Linux, cloud, network containers. So the enterprise environments highlights those types of environments, and consequently allows you to map TTPs for that particular environment. So think of corporate environments here. And then they're further subdivided into platforms where you have Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and then of course you have cloud environments, network, containers, etc. Cloud is further subdivided into infrastructure as a service and software as a service. So you talk about AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, Azure AD, so on and so forth. And then you have mobile, which is self-explanatory. That is divided into the two primary platforms, Android and iOS. So if you're looking for TTPs pertinent to, let's say, Android, you can utilize the Android matrix. And then, of course, very important, ICS. So ICS environments are very different. As a result, the TTPs that apply to an industrial control system environment are going to be very different, and and consequently, threat groups or adversaries that target ICS environments are going to utilize fairly different TTPs than they would typically utilize in an enterprise environment. And of course, I'll highlight this shortly. Speaking specifically on tactics, techniques, and procedures, it's very important to understand the distinction between them. While most of you may already know them, you can see that initial access in this particular example is a tactic. A tactic is made up of several techniques, and technique is made up of sub-techniques, right? And I'll get to procedures shortly, but what are tactics? Well, tactics essentially categorize each step of the adversary's attack methodology, and in specific, tactic represent the adversary's tactical goal or objective. So what are they trying to do? In this case, it's fairly simple to understand. Initial access, they're trying to gain initial access to a target environment, a target system, so on and so forth. And then techniques are used to outline how each tactic is orchestrated, and in specific, techniques describe actions taken by adversaries to achieve a particular objective. So if the objective is initial access, a technique essentially describes the different ways the adversary can essentially achieve a particular objective, in this case, initial access. And this should make sense now. If I want to obtain initial access to a target system or network, these are the techniques that make the most sense. So you have a drive-by compromise, exploit a public-facing application, target external remote services like RDP, VNC, so on and so forth. Phishing, very, very common when we talk about red team ops and adversary emulation. So phishing is a technique that has different, and I'll get into what a sub-technique is, but a sub-technique outlines the implementation of a specific technique in detail. So if a technique is too broad or has different variants or subsets, if you will, that's where you'll find a sub-technique. So phishing is too wide to make any sense from the perspective of an adversary. That's why it has sub-techniques for different not objectives, but essentially different ways of a different implementation of a particular technique. So you can see in this case, phishing is broken down into spear phishing attachments, spear phishing links, or spear phishing via service. And then, of course, you have procedures. Procedures outline all known implementations of a technique or sub-technique, and this is where atomic red team tests come into play. Because one of the issues when performing adversary emulation manually is that procedures are typically overlooked. And this is very important because different adversaries, different APT groups may all utilize the same techniques and or sub-techniques, but the procedures they utilize to execute a particular technique or sub-technique will vary. Obviously, if you take a look at an example like, let's say the discovery tactic, where you're performing local enumeration, and we're speaking specifically about enumerating network information. There's different ways you can do that on a Windows system. So Atomic Red Team really pays tribute to the fact that procedures are different based on every specific adversary. And this is where that granular control or this is rather the granular advantage that atomic red team tests can provide you with when performing adversary emulation. And then most importantly, this is specifically important for blue teamers and defenders. MITRE ATT&CK Framework also provides you with mitigations and detections for different techniques and sub-techniques. So for example, if you're taking a look at a particular technique and as a defender, you'd like to know how to mitigate this particular technique, it actually highlights that there and highlights different ways you can go about doing it. In this case, the technique that I essentially used for the mitigations and detections here is privilege escalation technique, where you're essentially bypassing user account control. And these are the different mitigations that can be put in place to essentially mitigate that technique from being executed successfully by an adversary or being used successfully by an adversary. So, you have very, very good recommendations here for mitigation. For example, privilege account management, remove users that do not need to be in the local administrators group. So, if you're dealing with Windows typically has a local administrator group. Make sure you remove any users that don't need to be there, because that sort of increases the threat surface there. Another option or other options here are user account control. So essentially modifying or heightening the actual security level of the user account control settings on Windows. And then very important for detection, this essentially highlights how this particular technique or sub-technique can be detected. And it highlights that in a very good way, because it starts off with the data source. So where you should be looking, for data. So in this case, you can see this is a command. And then the data component highlights the type of data. So, what type of data you should be looking for. If you're doing logging or you're trying to ship logs, you're trying to configure sysmon, etc., you're typically looking for command execution. And in terms of detection, you should monitor executed commands and arguments that may bypass UAC mechanisms to elevate process privileges on a system. So really, really helpful information provided by the MITRE ATT&CK Framework. And then finally, to end on this, when taking a look at a technique or sub-technique, you'll typically see that it has some metadata associated with it. And this metadata is very, very important, especially in the enterprise matrix, but also in the others, but I'll explain why shortly. So you'll typically see when you click on a technique, in this case, it'll highlight the technique ID, the sub-techniques that fall under this particular technique with their respective IDs, what tactic it falls under, and then the platforms this technique is applicable to or can be executed on. So it tells you this will work on Google Workspace, Linux, Office 365, software as a service, solutions, Windows, Mac OS, and then it provides you with contributors, the version, which is very important because the MITRE ATT&CK Framework is constantly being updated, and you might see in certain cases that technique and sub-technique IDs will be changed. So you always have to ensure that you're up to date. You don't really need to memorize all MITRE ATT&CK technique and sub-technique IDs, but just keep that in mind. And it also highlights when it was last updated. So in this case, the 4th of January, 2022. And some of the other pieces of metadata that aren't highlighted in this example here are applicable specifically to the post-exploitation tactics. So if we take a look at the privilege escalation techniques, you'll typically see permissions required and effective permissions as an additional piece of metadata attached to a technique or sub-technique. Permissions required represents the permissions required for an adversary to execute the technique. So, if you require specific privileges, let's say credential dumping, you'll typically see this highlighted in credential access techniques. It'll essentially tell you, in order for you to dump the LSAS process cache, you need to have an account with admin privileges or anti-authority system privileges. Effective permissions, this essentially tells you what permissions you will obtain after successful execution of a technique. This is more so applicable to privilege escalation. So it'll tell you, once you execute this technique successfully, these are the new privileges you'll get. Not really in some cases, you may be horizontally elevating your privileges. So you may be switching over to a service account or to another user account, but it'll essentially tell you that. And of course, one thing that I need to highlight here, and something that is greatly overlooked, is why utilize the MITRE ATT&CK framework? Why are so many security solutions incorporating the MITRE ATT&CK framework? Why are so many companies adopting the MITRE ATT&CK framework as a common knowledge base for its security personnel? Well, firstly, it provides attackers and defenders with a common knowledge base of adversarial behavior based on behavioral analysis of attacks and threat campaigns. What that means is that through the MITRE ATT&CK framework, attackers and defenders can better understand each other, and the data coming from both of them. So, if we take an example, informational reports in alignment with the MITRE ATT&CK framework that come from the red team to the blue team can easily be understood. Whereas if we were not using a standardized framework with a common knowledge base and common nomenclature, it can be very difficult to understand what the attackers or the red teamers were saying with regards to what you succeeded in and what you did not succeed in as blue teamers. Secondly, it organizes, categorizes, and contextualizes adversarial behavior based on the different phases of the attack lifecycle, which I've already highlighted. And it utilizes common and standardized nomenclature when referencing TTPs and APT groups, or groups in general. And of course, it is frequently updated. And I've highlighted the use cases already of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. You have adversary emulation, simulation, red team operations, cyber threat intelligence, defense gap analysis, detection and response, and of course, mitigation. And the URL is attack.mitre.org, and you can pretty much get the introduction to it just by taking a look at the first two paragraphs. And to begin with, if you've never used the MITRE ATT&CK framework before, it can be quite confusing as to what exactly is going on, because at the top here you have all of this categorization, and then at the bottom here you have the attack matrix for enterprise, which again highlights exactly what I showcased on the slides, where you have the tactics and then the techniques and then sub-techniques that fall under each particular technique, if applicable, if and when applicable. But to begin with, I would like to highlight the matrices first. All right, so this is typically where I recommend everyone starts in order to understand what a matrix is in the context of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So the MITRE ATT&CK framework utilizes matrices to essentially categorize different types of operational environments, the TTPs that apply to those environments based on the operating systems typically deployed in those environments, and also to categorize and to sort the TTPs for specific matrices based on the aforementioned factors, whether it be the operating system and or the different pieces of software or the TTPs that apply to that particular environment. So the enterprise matrix is fairly simple to understand. It's typically highlighting or representing what you're likely to find in an enterprise. That's as simple as I can put it, right? Now, when you talk about an enterprise, correctly so, an enterprise is going to consist of its own tactics based on all the known information and intelligence that we actually have, and this is, as you can already tell, starts off from reconnaissance all the way to exfiltration and impact. But also, this is one of the reasons why I think MITRE ATT&CK is really useful. It allows you to sort based on the types of operating systems or platforms you're likely to find in said matrix. So under the enterprise, you can see you have the pre matrix, which highlights the proprietary techniques. So where you have reconnaissance, resource development. It's very important to split these two. It's very important that you split these two tactics away from the rest in certain cases, because as I've mentioned and I've continued to point out, these are really big phases of any of the life cycle of any adversary, right? Recon and resource development, because it sets the stage for everything that they'll do after. So you can see that, very simple to understand. If I click on Windows, it's now going to limit the TTPs to only the ones that are applicable to the Windows operating system, whether it be Windows Desktop, Windows Server, etc. And you can do the same for Mac, and you should be able to see the difference. The same for Linux, and then in the case of cloud, this is further categorized into Office 365, so you can see that's reduced greatly, and the number of tactics is also reduced based on the type of platform or environment. And then, of course, you have Azure AD, Google Workspace, software as a service, and infrastructure as a service is where you typically find providers like AWS and traditional Azure. Azure AD is different because it really is increasingly, it's becoming an environment that's being targeted by adversaries, quite frequently now. And I think that this further categorization is very, very important. And then, of course, you have the same for network and containers. So containers, containerized environments. So, if you have a cluster of Docker hosts running various Docker containers, or you have a containerized environment, this is the matrix that would apply to you if you're a blue teamer or red teamer. And you can see that was last modified on the 1st of April 2022. No jokes there, I hope. And then you have mobile, which is further divided into Android and iOS, the two primary platforms here. And you can actually see the differences between the two. And then you have your industrial control system environment, or matrix. So you can see that this is very, very different than what you typically have with the enterprise matrix, in that you now have a new tactic that you don't typically see in the other ones, and that is the inhibit response function, impair process control, etc. So very, very useful categorization. But the default one displayed on the home page is the enterprise, the enterprise matrix. Now, when navigating around here, again, if this is new to you, this can be a bit confusing as to what you can do. But you can click on a tactic here. You can see that tactics, techniques, sub-techniques all have their unique IDs. If you click on a tactic, it'll give you a brief introduction as to what that tactic is all about. So the adversary is trying to gather information they can use to plan future operations. And then it highlights what this particular tactic consists of. So reconnaissance consists of techniques that involve adversaries actively or passively gathering information that they can be used to support targeting. It then lists out the techniques that fall under this tactic, as well as the IDs and the sub-technique IDs here. So you can see you have active scanning, gathering victim host information, victim network information, victim organization information, searching closed sources, searching open technical databases, and then searching open websites and domains. So, this is typically where you have OSINT, but it's sorted really well. The hierarchy is very easy to understand. Now, if I click on a particular technique here, one that has sub-techniques, I'll just click on the command and scripting interpreter technique here. You can see that a technique in certain cases may have sub-techniques. So you can see in this case, command and scripting interpreter is defined as a technique, and then as sub-techniques, the specific command and scripting interpreters are highlighted there. So PowerShell, Apple Script, Windows Command Shell, Unix Shell, so on and so forth. So it then tells you what this technique is used for. And if you now scroll down, you'll also see examples of procedures, right? And this is where, as I said, tools like the Atomic Red Team tests come into play. You have different groups that have their unique group IDs, and I'll explain this shortly. You then have the actual threat group. So the naming convention used, I'll actually go over that shortly, because I want to cover APT groups independently, but you can see you have their common names, so APT 1932, so on and so forth. It tells you examples of this particular, essentially gives you procedure examples tied to this particular technique or sub-technique. So it tells us part of your APT 19 downloaded and launched code within an SCT file. right? Or in this case, APT37 used Ruby scripts to execute payloads. So from this point onwards, talking about procedures specifically, and I'll get to them shortly, you can directly click on the group ID or the APT group itself, and that'll give you slightly different information in certain cases. But if I click on APT37, it tells you, gives you a brief introduction as to where it comes from, what their motivations are, what geographic regions they target, and then the associated group descriptions. So sort of the other names this group has been given or attributed based on some of their other operations. And I'll get to this because this is very important. And then it highlights the techniques that have been utilized before. I'll touch on the attack navigator layers for APT groups. But before I do that, I wanted to cover detection and mitigation, which I highlighted in the slides. But for every technique and sub-technique, you're going to have mitigations and detection. So most obvious mitigation for execution of malicious scripts is going to be an antivirus or anti-malware. Code signing, execution prevention makes sense in the case of PowerShell scripts, and then of course privileged account management, where if I just use this example here, when PowerShell is necessary, restrict PowerShell execution policy to only administrators. Be aware that there are methods of bypassing the PowerShell execution policy depending on the environment configuration. So really, really useful information there. And then, of course, you have detection, which I've already highlighted in the slides. And then most importantly, where is all of this information coming from? This is where you have the references, right? So you can take a look at all the references here to learn where this information came from. These are all very, very trusted sources, at least in the case of the latest updates, wherever possible. But the sources and references are actually scrutinized to a very high degree before any information or intelligence is taken or extrapolated from them and then highlighted in a meaningful way within the MITRE ATT&CK Framework knowledge base. You can sort through all of this, all of these segments or categorizations of the MITRE ATT&CK Framework, using the top toolbar here, as I've already done. Software is really, really cool. Software essentially, as it says here, is a generic term for custom or commercial code, operating system, utilities, open source software, other tools used to conduct behavior modeled in the attack framework. Some instances of software have multiple names associated with the same instance due to various organizations tracking the same set of software by different names. This is a common problem that you'll typically see, but this essentially allows you to identify, software that has been used by adversary groups, not really malicious software. Tools like AD find, not really malicious. It's used for local enumeration within Active Directory environments. But then you have your typical stuff, remote access tools. You have your poison ivies, etc., mimikatz, so on and so forth. They all have their own unique software IDs. And more importantly, if I click on a tool like, let's see, one that's quite interesting here. Let's see. Actually, let me just try and search for it. Let's just try certutil, which is not really malicious. It's a Windows utility, but it's typically used by adversaries to transfer files to and from Windows systems. But it highlights the techniques utilized by that particular piece of software. So in addition to mapping adversarial TTPs, it also maps the TTPs respective or with respects to the software that is being used. And these can also be represented individually on the attack navigator. So you typically see where it falls under. So, in this particular case, if I click on that particular technique ID there, you can see ingress tool transfer is the technique. This falls under command and control. So, certutil, as I pointed out earlier, can be used to transfer files to and from target system. In this particular case, a Windows system. So, Yeah, that's really what the MITRE ATT&CK framework is all about. Now, it's time to put it into action and show you how to use all of this information and knowledge and categorization to make sense of how adversaries operate, right? And by the way, everyone, as you already know, attack version 12 is now live, so you can actually take a look at the latest updates there.